Angela Grant was the kind of passenger most people didn't notice on flights. She never asked for upgrades, never spoke unless spoken to, and spent most of the time staring out the window or buried in a book. Today, she had chosen seat 22A on Flight 317 from Dallas to Denver, a mid-afternoon trip she had taken countless times. The sun streamed through the small oval window, bathing the cabin in a warm glow that made the gray interior feel almost comforting. Angela closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull her into a rare sense of calm. After a brutal week of board meetings, client calls, and hotel room dinners alone, this moment of quiet was sacred. Around her, the cabin was ordinary. A young couple whispered excitedly about an upcoming vacation. A toddler wailed in seat 23B, making his mother flinch repeatedly. The flight attendants moved efficiently, pushing carts and smiling politely, and passengers checked their phones or napped. Angela leaned her head back, thinking about the mountain town she was flying to, about the crisp air and pine-scented trails. This was a short, routine flight. She had done this route hundreds of times and trusted the pilots to handle the rest. But then came the first tremor. It wasn't violent at first, just a subtle vibration that rattled her coffee cup. Angela's eyes snapped open and she glanced around. Some passengers barely flinched, thinking it was turbulence. The couple in 22B laughed nervously, holding hands. The toddler stopped crying for a moment, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Then it hit again. Louder, sharper. The plane lurched violently, a bone-jarring jolt that slammed Angela into her seatbelt. She gripped the armrests, heart hammering in her chest. Overhead bins clattered. A tray fell from someone's lap, sending a plastic cup tumbling across the aisle. The entire cabin shuddered. She looked out the window and froze. Flames. Black smoke was licking from the right engine. Sparks danced across its metallic surface, rising against the sky in an ominous arc. "Holy," whispered a man across the aisle, eyes wide in disbelief. His voice cracked under the weight of the impossible. A booming sound shook the cabin, the roar of metal under extreme stress. Drinks sloshed over trays. A woman in row 21 shrieked, clutching her toddler. The flight attendants immediately sprang into action, but even their composed faces betrayed panic. Angela's mind raced. She had seen videos online, news stories about engine failures and emergency landings, but this wasn't a story anymore. This was happening to her in real time at 30,000 feet. Over the intercom, the captain's voice came, strained but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing technical difficulties. Oxygen masks may deploy. Stay calm." Angela's stomach dropped. Technical difficulties? This isn't just turbulence. Look at the engine. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then stabilized, then flickered again. A low rumble ran through the fuselage. Passengers began murmuring, the first whispers of fear spreading like wildfire. Angela reached up instinctively, gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles went white. She noticed the elderly man in 22C staring blankly ahead, frozen. Panic had paralyzed him. Angela leaned over and placed her hand on his arm. "It's okay," she said, forcing calm in her own voice. "I'll help you with your mask." His trembling hand barely managed to grasp the mask. Angela guided it to his face and secured it over his nose and mouth, her own hands shaking as she put hers on. The oxygen hissed in her ears, a strange, metallic sound that seemed almost mocking. The plane jolted again, violently, tilting slightly to the left. Angela's stomach lurched. She could see the engine now, its metal casing warped and smoking, fuel spraying in thin lines. Sparks sparked across the sky like fireworks, but deadly ones. She realized with a surge of icy panic, if this engine exploded, the fuselage could be torn apart. "Flight attendants, brace positions," came the captain's voice again, sharper this time, tinged with urgency. Angela's heart pounded, adrenaline flooding her system. She scanned the cabin. People were screaming, praying, holding hands, crying. She could smell the faint, acrid odor of smoke drifting back from the engine. Every instinct screamed at her to prepare for impact, But she also knew that panicking would get her nowhere. She had to act. She remembered her training from years ago. Before leaving the corporate world, she had done emergency communications and had been trained to stay calm in crises, to analyze situations logically. She had never thought she'd need those skills on a commercial flight, but now every memory of drills, protocols, and crisis handling came rushing back. She noticed the fire wasn't spreading yet, but the smoke was creeping along the fuselage. The descent wasn't controlled. Something else was wrong, she realized. Passengers were beginning to panic more violently. The couple in 22B were holding each other, faces pale. A man further back shouted in terror, banging on the overhead bin, while a mother frantically tried to calm her crying child. Angela's own breathing was fast, shallow, but her mind was eerily sharp. She caught the eye of a flight attendant rushing past. "Do you know what's happening?" Angela shouted over the roar of engines and screaming passengers. The attendant shook her head, eyes wide with fear. "We were losing altitude too fast. Brace yourselves." Angela's pulse skyrocketed. Losing altitude too fast meant one thing: they were in real danger. They were not just experiencing a mechanical failure, they were in a critical, life-threatening situation. She looked back at the elderly man beside her. His eyes were wide, filled with terror. "We're going to crash, aren't we?" he whispered. Angela swallowed hard. She wanted to reassure him, to offer words of comfort, but none came. Instead, she gripped his arm and whispered, "We survive by staying calm. Stay with me." Then came a new sound, the deep, violent roar of the engine sputtering. Flames erupted higher, sparks flying into the open air. The plane lurched again, violently to the right this time, and passengers screamed in unison. Angela's stomach dropped. Something was terribly wrong. This wasn't a normal engine failure. They could be minutes away from a catastrophe. And then a sound she would never forget. The captain's voice, firm but trembling, cutting across the intercom. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. We have lost power on our starboard engine. Everyone brace positions. Flight attendants prepare for emergency procedures." A hush fell over the cabin. Even the screaming seemed to pause, replaced by a collective realization. This was real. Death, or something very close to it, was staring back at every passenger. Angela's eyes widened as the plane tilted sharply, the earth suddenly seeming impossibly far away. Her knuckles whitened around the armrests. She swallowed, heart hammering, mind racing. And as the aircraft shuddered again, she realized one terrifying truth: this flight would never be ordinary again. And with that, the plane lurched violently downward into the thin air of the stratosphere, as if the sky itself had betrayed them. The roar of the failing engine filled the cabin, a terrifying soundtrack of metal straining against the sky. Passengers clutched whatever they could: a seat, a child, a friend's arm, as the plane tilted sharply to the left, lurching violently. Angela's fingers dug into the armrests until her knuckles ached. The elderly man beside her was frozen, eyes wide and unblinking, lips moving silently in prayer. Angela pressed her hand on his trembling arm again. "Breathe," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "We're going to breathe through this. Focus on me." His hand trembled in hers, small and frail, but he obeyed. Angela could feel her own heart hammering in response to his fear, but she forced herself to remain sharp. Panic would kill faster than the fire outside. Around her, the cabin had descended into controlled chaos. Children screamed, parents shouted, and flight attendants dashed between rows, barking orders, attempting to restore calm. One attendant, a young woman with dark hair pulled tight into a bun, ran past Angela, shouting at passengers to fasten seat belts and brace for impact. Angela looked out the window again. The flames from the right engine were now licking the fuselage, a jagged streak of orange and black curling into the blue sky. Sparks shot outward, like molten fireworks, scattering into the high-altitude wind. A thin trail of smoke traced behind the engine, darkening and thickening. She could feel the heat radiating through the cabin, subtle at first, but growing with every heartbeat. Something in Angela's gut screamed that this was far worse than anyone realized. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, trembling slightly now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are descending due to technical failure. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. Flight attendants, brace positions immediately." Angela noticed a pattern. The plane wasn't just losing altitude, it was dropping in uncontrolled bursts, jolting passengers violently. Normally, losing an engine would cause imbalance, but the craft would stabilize. This wasn't stabilizing. Something else was wrong. Fuel. The faint metallic scent had already begun to tickle Angela's nose. She realized that the fuel line could be compromised, that fire in the engine could reach it at any moment. Panic began to creep into the corners of her mind. A mother in row 23 clutched her daughter to her chest, rocking her, whispering, "It's okay, honey, we're okay, mommy's here." But her eyes betrayed her, she wasn't sure. Angela noticed a man further down the aisle trying to stand to help others, but he was shoved back into his seat by a flight attendant. "Sit down, brace," she barked. Angela realized that in the middle of panic, fear could make people dangerous, people desperate to act without awareness. Angela's mind raced. In her previous career, she had been trained to observe the smallest details under extreme stress. She scanned the cabin systematically. Oxygen masks were deployed but functioning. The elderly man was breathing but frightened. The couple in 22B were holding hands so tightly Angela could see their knuckles blanching. The toddler had stopped crying but clung to his mother's chest with wide, terrified eyes. Every single person had a story, every single one of them terrified. And Angela knew, if she froze, if she did nothing, someone would die because she didn't act. She reached into her bag, fumbling for her phone, hopping for a signal. Nothing. No signal, she muttered under her breath. The panic creeping in her chest threatened to drown her, but she forced it down. She couldn't think about help from the ground. They were alone up here. The plane jolted again, violently. The cabin lights flickered. Angela grabbed the elderly man and pulled him close to the seat in front of them, bracing against the next lurch. She heard the distinct cracking of overhead compartments. Luggage shifted violently, and a heavy suitcase tumbled down the aisle, smashing into the wall with a deafening thud. Passengers screamed. Someone fainted, and a flight attendant caught them before they hit the floor. Angela's own chest burned as she forced herself to focus. Then she noticed a young man across the aisle, frozen, eyes glued to the flaming engine outside. His phone was in his hand, recording, but he wasn't moving. Angela leaned over and shook him. "We need to move. Brace positions." He blinked rapidly, snapping out of shock, and complied. From the cockpit came another transmission, brief and tense. "Cabin crew, prepare for emergency landing. We may not reach the airport." Angela's stomach plummeted. They weren't going to glide into a perfect runway. They were descending over farmland, over rivers, over areas that offered no guarantee of safety. Panic was spreading like wildfire. Passengers began shouting for answers, their voices overlapping into a chaotic crescendo. Angela could feel the fear radiating from the crowd, a tangible force that threatened to engulf them all. The flight attendant in her row, trying to maintain composure, started instructing everyone to prepare for brace positions. "Lean forward, hands over your heads, everyone brace." But the turbulence made it nearly impossible to hold the position. Angela grabbed the elderly man's shoulders, pressing him into his seat, and forced herself down into the brace. The next jolt threw her forward violently, and she felt her body press painfully against the seatbelt. Angela stole another glance at the burning engine. Sparks now flew in wide arcs, streaking against the fading daylight. The acrid scent of smoke grew stronger. The plane shuddered again, more violently than before. The passenger across from her screamed, "We're going to die, we're going to die." Angela looked him in the eye. "Listen to me," she said firmly, voice trembling but resolute. "Survive. Focus on surviving. Nothing else matters. Just breathe, survive." But even as she spoke the words, she realized the gravity of the situation. The plane was not just failing mechanically, it was failing in every conceivable way. One engine down, fuel leaking, flames licking the fuselage, uncontrolled descent, panic spreading. The entire aircraft was a ticking time bomb, and they were all trapped inside. Angela glanced at the oxygen mask again, making sure it was secure. She reached for the elderly man, checking that it hadn't shifted. She scanned the cabin once more. Children were huddled to their parents. Flight attendants were moving quickly, their faces pale, eyes wide. Panic had its own rhythm now, a wave of chaos rolling through the cabin. Then just as suddenly, the plane lurched violently to the right, faster than before. Drinks and unsecured objects tumbled, and passengers screamed in unison. Angela felt her stomach drop as the aircraft tilted, a harsh, punishing reminder of their altitude and speed. The roar of the engine, the crackle of sparks, the screams of terrified passengers, it all combined into a single, deafening roar that rattled Angela's chest. She tightened her grip on the elderly man's arm and whispered, "Hold on, we're not done yet." And then, through the chaos, the captain's voice returned over the intercom, low and trembling but unmistakable. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are losing altitude too rapidly. Brace positions. Emergency landing may be imminent. Please hold on." Angela swallowed hard, every muscle tense, her mind racing. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood red and orange, a beautiful, terrifying contrast to the disaster unfolding around them. Sparks flew from the engine, black smoke curling upward, and Angela realized that in the next few moments, every second would count. And in that instant, the plane jolted once more, violently, as if the sky itself were ripping the aircraft apart. The plane pitched violently again, throwing passengers forward despite their seat belts. Angela's knuckles were raw from gripping the armrests. She could feel every vibration, every jolt, as if the metal of the aircraft itself was protesting its own survival. Outside, the burning engine spewed black smoke in twisting spirals against the fatting blue sky. The acrid scent of fuel had grown stronger, curling into the cabin and making it hard to breathe. Panic had fully taken hold of the passengers. Some were screaming, some were praying, some had gone rigid in shock. Angela leaned over the elderly man, checking his oxygen mask again, making sure it hadn't slipped. His eyes were wide, staring past her into the smoke-filled air, lips moving silently as he murmured a prayer. "It's okay," she said, more to convince herself than him. "We're okay, just breathe, focus on breathing." But she knew deep down that survival wasn't guaranteed. The plane was descending too fast, its balance thrown off by the failed engine. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, more urgent this time. "Cabin crew, prepare for immediate emergency landing. Brace positions now. Everyone brace positions. Repeat, brace positions." Angela noticed the cabin crew moving with a controlled urgency. Flight attendants ran down the aisles, urging passengers to brace, shouting instructions, but it was chaos. A woman near the front had a child screaming in her lap, tears streaking her face. A man further back was frozen, eyes glued to the burning engine, unable to move. Angela's pulse quickened. In a situation like this, one frozen person could mean disaster, not just for themselves but for those around them. She remembered her training, emergency response drills, crisis simulations, years of handling panic in controlled environments. None of it compared to the reality of being trapped in a metal tube plummeting through the sky. But Angela forced herself to think clearly. She assessed her surroundings, oxygen masks deployed and functioning, belts fastened, elderly man conscious, passengers mostly seated, chaos spreading but still containable. The plane jolted again, violently tilting left, and Angela's stomach lurched. A tray fell from an overhead bin, shattering against the floor. The toddler behind her wailed uncontrollably, piercing the chaos with pure terror. Angela reached back instinctively, trying to soothe him, whispering, "It's going to be okay, you're safe. Breathe." The mother clutched him, rocking him, but her hands shook violently. Angela realized that fear was contagious, and she had to remain calm, or risk becoming another source of panic. From the cockpit came another transmission, short and clipped. "Mayday, all passengers brace for emergency landing. Altitude decreasing rapidly. Prepare for impact. Angela's stomach dropped. Emergency landing. Not a glide, not a controlled descent. A landing that would test every second of their preparation and luck. She scanned the cabin systematically, noticing small but critical details. The couple in 22B were holding each other tightly, knuckles white. The elderly man was breathing, but his grip on her arm was weak. A man across the aisle had begun to panic again, fumbling with his phone instead of focusing on bracing. Angela leaned over and grabbed his shoulders. "Listen to me," she shouted over the roar of engines and screaming passengers. "Brace positions. Focus on surviving." The man's eyes widened, and he obeyed. Angela pressed her forehead to the back of the seat in front of her, bracing herself for the next jolt. She could feel the plane tipping again, violently, and heard the sickening groan of metal straining under pressure. Sparks from the engine flared into the sky, black smoke curling upward. The smell of burning fuel filled her nostrils. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Angela forced it down, focusing on breathing, on observation, on survival. She noticed the fire creeping along the fuselage, small but insidious. If it reached the wing fuel line, the results would be catastrophic. She realized that the pilot and crew were doing everything possible, but even their training might not be enough. Angela knew she couldn't control the engines or the fire, but she could influence the passengers around her. Calm them, guide them, prevent further chaos. Another lurch threw her forward, and she pressed herself against the seat in front, heart pounding. She glanced at the elderly man again. His eyes were wide with terror, and Angela could feel his fear radiating into her chest. "We can survive this," she whispered. "We will survive this." The words felt fragile, almost absurd, against the reality of the situation, but they were all she could cling to. A young flight attendant ran past, yelling at passengers to hold brace positions. Her face was pale, eyes wide, but she moved with a deadly seriousness that commanded attention. Angela realized that in this moment, leadership mattered more than anything else. Panic spread like wildfire, and without someone to guide them, chaos would consume the cabin. Angela looked at the window again. The engine's flames were growing, sparks flaring into the fading light. She could see the jagged black streak of smoke curling behind the aircraft, twisting and stretching in the wind. The plane lurched violently again, throwing a woman across the aisle. Angela jumped, catching her before she fell. "Hold on," Angela shouted, pressing her body against the woman, steadying her. Around them, the plane groaned, twisted, and shuddered. Every vibration was a reminder that the aircraft was fragile, teetering on the edge between survival and catastrophe. Then came the unmistakable sound of something breaking, metal groaning under pressure. Angela's heart leapt into her throat. Sparks flew from the engine, and the smell of fuel became overwhelming. Passengers screamed, some crying, some whispering desperate prayers. Angela's mind raced. They were descending too fast. The fire was spreading. If the engine exploded? She swallowed hard, fighting panic. Focus. Help where you can, survive. She reached for the elderly man, checking his oxygen mask one last time. The couple in 22B clung to each other. The flight attendant ran past again, shouting orders, but the passengers were beginning to fight against instinct, some frozen, some hysterical. Angela realized the plane was a cage filled with fear, with fire, with imminent danger. And then the plane tilted sharply again, violently, throwing Angela against her seatbelt. Sparks from the engine erupted brighter, flames licking higher. The metallic roar of the failing engine drowned out everything else. Angela pressed her forehead to the seat in front, bracing for the worst. And in that moment she realized, the plane was not just failing, they were running out of time. The descent was accelerating. The engine fire was spreading, and whatever awaited them below, whether an airport runway, a field, or nothing at all, would arrive in seconds. The plane shuddered again, violently this time, as if it were teetering on the edge of collapse. Angela felt her chest compress against the seatbelt, every muscle tense, every nerve screaming. Sparks flared from the right engine like molten stars exploding in miniature. Smoke spiraled into the cabin, curling around passengers' faces and filling their lungs with acrid heat. The acrid smell of burning fuel was strong now, thickening the air with every heartbeat. Panic surged in waves, crashing over passengers like a storm. Angela could hear the terrified gasps, screams, and whispered prayers all blending into a single, chaotic symphony. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, strained but forceful. "Cabin crew, prepare for emergency landing. Altitude decreasing rapidly. We may not reach the airport. Brace positions immediately." Angela's stomach lurched. "May not reach the airport." That phrase repeated in her mind like a warning drum. She had flown countless times, but nothing had prepared her for this. Every second now counted. Every small decision could be the difference between life and death. The elderly man beside her trembled violently, eyes wide and fixed on the engine's flames. Angela grabbed his hand and squeezed it firmly. "Listen to me," she said, voice tight but steady. "Breathe with me, focus, survive." He nodded weakly, shaking with terror, but clung to her words. Angela realized that in this moment, every passenger's survival depended not just on the crew, but on those who refused to panic. She scanned the cabin, assessing the chaos. A mother clutched her child to her chest, rocking back and forth, whispering, "It's going to be okay." Her own fear was palpable, but she tried to project calm. A man across the aisle was frozen, eyes glued to the burning engine, phone in hand, seemingly paralyzed. Angela leaned over and shook him firmly. "We need to brace. Now, focus." He blinked rapidly, forcing himself to obey. The flight attendants moved like soldiers, barking instructions over the roar of failing engines. Angela noticed the pattern. The fire wasn't just on the engine anymore. It was beginning to creep along the wing, a thin orange line that flickered against the metallic surface. Sparks flew outward, and the smell of fuel grew heavier, a tangible warning of danger. If the fire reached the fuel line, the result would be catastrophic. Angela forced herself to remain calm. She scanned the cabin systematically, observing each passenger, noting who could move and who might need help. The couple in 22B clung together, faces pale, hands locked tightly. The toddler in row 23 whimpered, sensing the fear in the cabin. Angela swallowed hard and turned her attention to the crew. The attendants were moving efficiently, but even their composure couldn't hide the growing terror in their eyes. Suddenly, the plane tilted sharply to the left, throwing Angela forward violently. She slammed against the seatbelt and pressed herself down, knuckles whitening. Sparks flared again from the engine, black smoke curling upward in twisted ribbons. The passengers screamed, some clutching each other, some frozen in shock. Angela realized that the plane was no longer just malfunctioning. It was failing, its balance unstable, the descent accelerating. Her mind raced. "We're going to crash unless we can stabilize." She glanced at the elderly man beside her. His eyes were wide, hands shaking. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Focus on surviving. That's all that matters right now." From the cockpit, the alarms blared incessantly. The captain's voice broke through again, tense but determined. "Brace for emergency landing. We are losing altitude faster than anticipated. Flight attendants, evacuate procedures at the ready." Angela realized they weren't going to make a controlled landing. The plane was descending too fast, and the fire was spreading along the fuselage. Sparks rained from the engine like deadly confetti. Passengers screamed in unison, a chorus of terror that rattled Angela's chest. A mother in row 21 tried to hold her toddler, but the child slipped from her arms during a violent jolt. Angela reacted instinctively, catching the child midair, pressing him to her chest. The mother gasped, gratitude and fear etched across her face. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming. Angela nodded but had no time to respond. Every second mattered. The plane jolted again, violently to the right. The flames on the engine flickered higher, sparks igniting the trailing smoke. The acrid stench of fuel filled every corner of the cabin, burning lungs and eyes alike. Angela realized something critical. If the fire reached the fuel line, there would be no surviving this. She needed to help others evacuate once they landed. But first, They had to survive the descent. Angela scanned the cabin, noting the passengers who could move and those who might be trapped by fear or injury. She leaned over the frozen young man again. "Listen to me. Brace positions. Focus." His eyes darted toward the flames, then he forced himself down into the brace, following her instructions. The captain's voice came again, trembling now. "Prepare for impact. We may not reach the runway. Brace positions. Brace positions." Angela's heart pounded. Impact is coming. Now. She pressed her forehead to the seat in front, knuckles dug into the fabric. Sparks flared outside, black smoke curling into the fatting sunlight. She felt the heat creeping closer, small but insidious, a reminder of the danger still to come. Another violent jolt threw the plane sideways. Angela braced herself, her body pressed tight to the seat. She could hear luggage smashing to the floor, passengers screaming, the wail of children piercing the chaos. The elderly man beside her whimpered, fear threatening to paralyze him. Angela gripped his arm firmly. "We survive together," she whispered. "Focus. Survive." A flight attendant sprinted down the aisle, shouting over the roar of engines and screaming passengers. "Brace positions. Everyone brace. Keep calm." Her face was pale, eyes wide, but she moved with authority, forcing compliance where panic threatened to spread. Angela glanced at the young couple in 22B. The woman's grip on her husband's arm was so tight their knuckles had turned white. Angela leaned over. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "Brace positions. Focus on breathing. Survive." Their eyes met hers, terror and trust colliding in a fleeting instant. The plane jolted again, violently, and Angela realized the inevitable. They were about to hit the ground. Sparks flared higher, the engine hissed and cracked, and the acrid scent of burning fuel was overwhelming. She looked at the passengers around her, children, couples, the elderly, and felt the weight of responsibility. She couldn't control the plane, couldn't stop the fire, but she could guide, protect, and survive alongside them. Then came the sound that made every nerve in her body scream, the sharp tearing of metal, a high-pitched scream of strain from the fuselage. The plane tilted sharply, the flames from the engine dancing higher, and Angela pressed herself down into the brace position, eyes wide, heart hammering. The captain's voice came one last time before impact, firm, determined but trembling. "Brace for emergency landing. This is it. Hold on." Angela's breath caught. Every second stretched into an eternity. Sparks danced outside the window. Smoke curled through the cabin. Panic, terror, and hope collided in a single heartbeat. And in that moment, as the ground loomed closer with terrifying speed, Angela realized survival would not be handed to them. They had to fight for it, every passenger, every second, every movement. The impact hit like a thunderclap. The plane slammed against the ground with bone-jarring force, metal screeching and bending under the weight of gravity and speed. Passengers screamed, arms flailing, heads slamming into seats, luggage tumbling down the aisles in a chaotic avalanche. Angela's body was pressed into her seatbelt, muscles coiled like springs, bracing against the violent shakes of the fuselage. Sparks flew from the engine, trailing fire along the side of the aircraft. The smell of burning fuel was intense now, thick and suffocating. Every instinct screamed, "Move, survive." The plane skidded across the uneven field, bouncing, scraping, twisting. Angela kept her eyes forward, her mind calculating, anticipating every jolt. The elderly man beside her clutched her arm, knuckles white, his body shaking. She whispered to him again, "We survive together. Hold on. Breathe." He nodded, trembling but obedient. Around them, chaos tore through the cabin. A woman screamed for her child. A man shouted prayers into the air. And the toddler in row 23 screamed again, terrified but alive in his mother's arms. Angela glanced out the window. The field beneath them was uneven, littered with rocks and low brush, no runway in sight. Sparks from the engine had ignited dry grass near the plane, and she realized they had only seconds before fire threatened the fuselage directly. The acrid smoke began to fill the cabin more heavily, making breathing difficult. Every movement, every second now mattered. The captain's voice boomed over the intercom, strained but resolute. "Evacuate! Evacuate immediately! Leave everything! Everyone slide! Go!" Angela reacted instantly, her mind racing. She pressed herself down into the brace position as the plane skidded violently again, bouncing over rocks and uneven ground. The fuselage groaned under stress, and the fire on the engine crept closer to the wings. Sparks flared dangerously. Angela could see the flight attendants moving quickly, herding passengers toward the exits, but the panic had already taken root. People froze. People screamed. People struggled with fear and confusion. Angela grabbed the elderly man and helped him to his feet. "We go now," she shouted over the roar of the engines and the crackle of fire. He obeyed, shaking violently, stumbling toward the emergency exit. She grabbed his arm, steadying him as the fuselage shuddered. Outside, the slide had deployed, fluttering in the wind like a lifeline dangling from the sky. Angela pushed him onto it first, ensuring he landed safely on the ground below. She turned to help the young couple in 22B, but a sudden jolt slammed the plane sideways. A nearby overhead bin tore free, tumbling toward them. Angela ducked instinctively, grabbing the man and pulling him to the side. The woman screamed, clutching her husband. Angela pressed herself against them, guiding them toward the exit. Sparks flew dangerously close. The acrid smoke burned her lungs, but she forced herself forward, adrenaline surging through every vein. Then came a new horror. A mother near the rear was screaming, trapped. Her toddler had slipped from her arms during a violent jolt, wedged under a seat. Angela didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the aisle, ducking luggage and passengers, heart pounding, lungs burning. The flames from the engine had crept dangerously close now, licking the side of the fuselage. She could feel the heat radiating like invisible fingers of fire. "Help me," the mother cried, panic-stricken. Angela grabbed the child, pressing the small body to her chest. The mother's face was a mix of terror and relief. Angela shoved both toward the emergency exit, ignoring the sparks that flared dangerously near her feet. Another violent shudder threw her off balance, but she forced herself to move forward, guided only by survival instinct. Outside, the ground rushed to meet them. The emergency slide felt unstable under her weight, but she guided the mother and child first, ensuring they landed safely. The elderly man had already moved to the side, breathing hard, eyes wide but alive. The couple followed. Angela turned back toward the cabin and froze. Another passenger, a teenage girl, was still trapped by a jammed seatbelt, screaming. Flames from the engine had moved closer. The smoke was thicker now, blinding, choking. Angela didn't hesitate. She dashed back inside, ignoring the heat burning through her jacket. She reached the girl, a pale face streaked with tears, eyes wide with terror. "I've got you," Angela shouted, pressing the seatbelt release with every ounce of strength. The mechanism groaned but finally yielded. She lifted the girl into her arms, heart hammering, lungs burning, and ran back toward the exit. Sparks leapt from the fuselage as if trying to catch them. Outside, the mother and child had moved to safety. The elderly man was helping the couple. Angela slid down the emergency chute with the girl pressed to her chest. She landed roughly, rolling to absorb the impact, coughing from the smoke and heat. The ground was uneven, scraping her palms and knees, but she pushed forward, dragging the girl to a safe distance. Behind her, the plane shuddered violently, sparks erupting along the wing. The roar of fire and the screech of metal filled the night air. Angela turned, heart pounding, eyes wide. Flames licked the fuselage, spreading across the wing. The plane groaned, twisted, and in a final shudder the fire ignited the fuel line. A deafening explosion shook the ground, throwing debris into the air. Passengers screamed, some ducking instinctively, others frozen in shock. Angela pressed herself into the dirt, shielding the girl as shrapnel fell around them. She looked around. The elderly man, the young couple, the mother and child, all alive, shaken but safe. Angela's chest heaved, lungs burning from smoke and exertion. She realized she was trembling violently but alive. And then a new sound cut through the chaos, the distant wail of sirens. Firefighters and emergency crews were approaching, flashing lights cutting through the night like beacons of hope. Angela's mind raced. They had survived the landing, but the danger wasn't over. Fire still consumed the plane. Smoke choked the field. Passengers were scattered, some injured, some in shock. She had to keep moving, guide them to safety, ensure no one was left behind. She glanced at the young girl in her arms. The girl's tears had stopped, eyes wide and unblinking, staring at Angela. Angela forced a small smile. "You're safe now," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. "We all are for now." The plane behind them was now a roaring inferno, flames shooting into the night sky. Sparks rained down and the fuselage groaned and twisted as metal gave way to fire. Angela felt a mix of relief and terror. They had survived the initial crash, but the night was far from over. The field was a chaotic inferno of smoke, fire, and screaming passengers. Angela stumbled across the uneven ground, lungs burning from inhaling smoke, knees scraped and bleeding from the rough landing. The teenage girl clung to her hand, shivering violently, eyes wide with terror. Around them, others were emerging from the wreckage, coughing, crying, disoriented, and some injured. Sparks still flew from the plane's fuselage as flames devoured the twisted metal. The acrid smell of burning fuel made Angela gag, but she forced herself forward, guiding the girl toward a safer distance. She scanned the field quickly. The elderly man was leaning on a nearby passenger for support, visibly shaken but alive. The young couple huddled together, their faces pale, hands gripping each other's tightly. The mother held her toddler close, eyes wide and frantic, scanning the smoldering wreckage to ensure no one else was trapped. Angela realized with a jolt that even though they had survived the initial crash, the fire was spreading. A single misstep could ignite the grass beneath them, or worse, consume another part of the plane that still held passengers inside. Angela's instincts kicked in. She ran back toward the burning fuselage, ignoring the heat and the smoke choking her throat. She could see movement inside, another passenger trapped by a jammed seatbelt, banging desperately against the metal frame. Angela sprinted, heart hammering, and shouted over the roar of fire, "Hold on, I've got you." Inside the cabin, the heat was unbearable. Flames licked along the walls, sparks shooting into the air. Angela lunged toward the trapped man, yanking at the jammed seatbelt with every ounce of strength. The metal groaned under the pressure, and for a terrifying moment it seemed as though the latch would not release. She gritted her teeth, pulling harder. Finally, with a wrenching snap, the seatbelt gave way. Angela dragged the man to the exit, ignoring the blistering heat on her arms. She slid down the emergency chute with him, landing hard on the uneven ground. Both tumbled, scraping and bruising themselves, but they were alive. Around them, passengers continued to emerge, coughing, screaming, clinging to one another, desperate for safety. Angela turned back toward the wreckage. Sparks were now shooting higher, the fire spreading along the fuselage like wildfire. Every second they delayed could mean more lives lost. Angela saw a young woman pinned under part of the collapsed overhead compartment. Without hesitation, she sprinted, ignoring the smoke and heat, and grabbed the debris. With a mighty heave, she lifted it just enough for the woman to crawl free. The woman scrambled toward the field, coughing, tears streaking her soot-covered face. Angela's arms burned from the effort, but she forced herself onward. A sudden crack made her freeze. The plane groaned ominously, metal twisting under the heat. Flames shot higher, and for a terrifying moment, Angela feared the plane would explode entirely. She realized they had to move everyone farther away to a clear area where emergency crews could reach them. She sprinted toward the scattered passengers, shouting instructions above the chaos. "This way, keep moving, away from the fire." Some passengers were injured, limping, or unable to move without help. Angela grabbed an injured man's arm, supporting him as they navigated through smoke and flames. She pulled him toward the far side of the field, where the grass was unburned and the fire seemed to stop. The elderly man followed closely, supporting a woman with a twisted ankle. Children clung to their parents, crying, but moving forward under Angela's direction. Suddenly, a small explosion erupted from the fuselage, throwing a shower of sparks into the night. Angela ducked instinctively, dragging a young girl along with her. The child's sobs pierced the night, but Angela murmured soothingly, "It's okay. You're safe now, keep moving." She could feel the heat on her skin, smell the smoke filling her lungs, but she refused to stop. Stopping meant death for herself or for others. Emergency vehicles appeared in the distance, their sirens cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. Firefighters sprinted toward the plane, hoses spraying water over the flames, while paramedics rushed to tend to the injured. Angela guided passengers toward them, ensuring they stayed together. "Keep moving, don't stop. Emergency crews are here." Her voice was hoarse from shouting, but the passengers followed, trusting her direction. One man collapsed to the ground, clutching his leg, screaming in pain. Angela rushed to him, lifting him with the help of two others. They carried him toward the emergency crews, passing through clouds of smoke and sparks. Flames roared behind them, the plane twisting and groaning, threatening to consume everything in its path. Angela's lungs burned, eyes stung from smoke, but she refused to stop. She glanced around. Everyone she had seen survive the initial crash was now moving toward safety, but the plane still held danger. Flames flared near the emergency exit on the other side, and Angela realized one of the flight attendants had not yet emerged. Without hesitation, she ran back, weaving through smoke and debris, searching for the crew member. She found her pinned under a twisted seat, coughing violently. "I've got you," Angela shouted, lifting the attendant just enough to crawl free. They emerged into the field together, stumbling, coughing, but alive. Emergency crews took over, directing passengers to safety and attending to the injured. Angela stood for a moment, chest heaving, watching the inferno consume the plane behind them. Sparks shot into the night sky, flames licking higher, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air. She realized with a jolt that they had survived the crash and evacuation, but the danger was far from over. Paramedics rushed toward the injured, firefighters sprayed water across the flames, and police secured the area. Angela looked around at the passengers she had helped guide, children clinging to parents, the elderly man still shaking but alive, couples holding each other tight, a mother and toddler crying together. She felt a mix of exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. They had survived something that should have killed them. And yet, even as she breathed heavily, the reality sank in. The plane had exploded, fire still roared, and for many of the passengers, the trauma had only just begun. Angela realized that survival was only the first step. They would need help, care, and reassurance, and someone had to guide them through the immediate aftermath. The chaos of the field was overwhelming, but Angela forced herself to focus. The initial panic had subsided slightly, replaced by the raw shock of survival. Emergency lights cut through the smoke, illuminating the scorched wreckage of the plane and the scattered passengers. Sirens screamed in the distance as fire trucks and ambulances raced across the uneven terrain. The acrid stench of burning fuel still clung to the air, making each breath a challenge. Angela's lungs burned, but she refused to stop moving. Every second counted, and she knew that lives still depended on her composure. She glanced at the passengers around her. Injured individuals were crying out in pain, some clutching broken limbs, others in shock, staring blankly at the inferno behind them. A mother clutched her toddler to her chest, whispering frantic reassurances. The elderly man she had guided earlier was helping a woman with a twisted ankle, but his face was pale, fear and exhaustion etched into every line. Angela realized that despite surviving the crash, they were not yet safe. Panic still lingered, and danger remained very real. Angela moved among them, offering guidance, reassurance, and physical support where needed. "Stay together. Keep moving to the left, away from the fire," she shouted, over the roar of flames and the wail of sirens. Some passengers stumbled, others froze, but her voice carried authority. Slowly, they began to respond, moving toward the emergency crews and the designated safe zone that had been set up by first responders. A young woman with blood streaming down her arm screamed for help, unable to move. Angela ran to her side, pressing a hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. "You're going to be okay," she said firmly, locking eyes with the woman. "Stay with me. Keep breathing. Help is coming." She kept her voice calm, controlled, knowing that panic could make the injury far worse. The woman nodded weakly, tears streaking her soot-covered face, and Angela helped her toward the emergency medical personnel. Nearby, a man was trapped under debris, unable to free himself. Angela sprinted, lifting metal scraps with the aid of two other passengers who had regained their composure. Sparks flared dangerously close, smoke stinging their eyes, but they pressed forward, finally freeing him. Angela guided him toward the safety of the responders, making sure his weight was supported and that he remained conscious. Every movement, every step was calculated, driven by the knowledge that hesitation could cost lives. The elderly man she had helped earlier now took on a surprising role, assisting other passengers who were struggling to walk. Angela felt a surge of gratitude. In the midst of fear, people could rise to the occasion. The young couple she had guided earlier held hands tightly, helping another injured passenger to their feet. Angela allowed herself a brief nod of acknowledgement. They were beginning to work together as a unit, survivors aiding survivors. Firefighters arrived at the wreckage, spraying water over the flames in controlled arcs, hissing steam rising from the heated metal. Paramedics rushed to attend to the injured, triaging the most critical first. Angela assisted wherever she could, pointing out injured passengers, guiding children away from the fire, and keeping panic from spiraling out of control. Every second felt like an eternity. Then came a moment that made her blood run cold. A small secondary explosion from the plane's fuselage sent a shower of sparks across the field. A young boy nearby screamed, stumbling backward toward the still smoldering wreckage. Angela reacted instantly, sprinting, grabbing his arm and pulling him to safety. His mother clutched him tightly, sobbing in relief. Angela didn't pause to acknowledge her own adrenaline or fear. She moved immediately to the next passenger, the next threat, the next injured individual. The screams of the terrified passengers were now mixed with the authoritative commands of emergency personnel. "Move back! Fire hazard!" shouted a firefighter, pointing to a spreading patch of burning grass. Angela directed those nearby to safety, guiding them further from the inferno. She felt the heat on her back, smelled the smoke, and knew that every second spent hesitating could lead to catastrophe. As the field filled with emergency crews, Angela realized they were finally out of immediate danger, but the night was far from over. Injuries ranged from minor burns and scrapes to broken limbs and smoke inhalation. Parents clutched their children, crying, shaking, trying to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. The elderly man beside her had tears in his eyes, voice trembling. I thought we were gone," he whispered. Angela squeezed his arm reassuringly. "We survived. That's all that matters, we're alive." Despite the relief, Angela felt a gnawing tension. Some passengers were still missing, trapped under wreckage or too injured to move without assistance. She scanned the fire-engulfed plane, noting areas where movement was impossible and where emergency personnel were focused. Her heart raced as she realized that survival was just the beginning. They still had to account for every person. Angela moved among the passengers, helping calm the terrified, supporting the injured, and ensuring no one wandered too close to danger. She coordinated with paramedics, pointing out children and adults who were disoriented, ensuring they received immediate attention. Her exhaustion was absolute, muscles trembling, lungs burning from smoke inhalation, yet she refused to stop. Every life saved added weight to her responsibility, and she would not fail them. Amid the chaos, a paramedic approached, recognizing Angela's presence and leadership. "You've been incredible," he said, voice urgent. "We need all hands assisting with triage and keeping the injured calm." Angela nodded, accepting the new responsibility. She helped guide passengers into makeshift triage areas, keeping them calm while paramedics worked. She applied pressure to wounds, assisted with stretchers, and whispered constant reassurance. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely. The fire was slowly being contained, but smoke still choked the field, heat radiated from the plane, and fear lingered in every corner. Angela glanced at the passengers she had helped guide. The elderly man, the young couple, the mother and child, the teenage girl, all alive, shaken, but surviving. They clung to one another, expressions a mix of relief, exhaustion, and disbelief. Then a sudden shout from a firefighter drew Angela's attention. "We've got a report of another passenger still inside the fuselage." Panic flashed across the survivors' faces. Angela's stomach lurched. She had survived, guided others to safety, but one person still trapped meant one life hung in the balance. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the burning wreckage alongside the emergency crew. Determination, Angela sprinted across the scorched field, her lungs burning with each gasp of smoke-filled air. Flames licked the twisted fuselage, sparks shooting like miniature fireworks, and the acrid smell of fuel stung her eyes and throat. The firefighter leading the way shouted over the roar of the fire, "There's a passenger still inside, trapped near the wing. Move fast." Angela's heart jumped. She had guided dozens to safety, but this was the final life that depended on her, and she refused to fail. She ducked under a flare of sparks, crouching low as she entered the fuselage once more. The interior was a chaotic maze of twisted metal, debris, and smoke. Heat radiated from the fire outside, making the metal walls almost unbearable to touch. Angela forced herself to focus. Panic could kill, focus could save. She moved quickly, scanning each row, eyes sharp, every second counting. A faint, terrified cry caught her attention. "Help, please, somebody help me." The voice was weak, raspy with smoke inhalation. Angela followed it to a mangled seat near the wing. A man was trapped beneath the twisted metal of an overhead compartment, face pale, coughing violently, his leg pinned awkwardly. Flames licked the aisle nearby, sending sparks dangerously close. Angela swallowed hard, ignoring the heat searing her jacket, and shouted, "I've got you. Hold on, I'm getting you out." She wrapped her arms around the man, trying to lift the debris, but it wouldn't budge. She kicked, twisted, and heaved, sweat and soot streaking her face. The man gasped, eyes wide with terror. I can't move," he choked out. Angela gritted her teeth. "You will move. You will survive. Hold on." She shouted instructions for the firefighters to bring tools, and together they leveraged a pry bar and a crowbar, lifting the metal enough for the man to crawl free. Angela guided him through the cabin, shielding him from the sparks and flames, her hands raw and blistered from contact with hot metal. The heat radiated like a physical force, but she didn't slow. Step by step, she moved toward the emergency exit. Finally, the metal slide appeared before them, the cool night air beckoning like salvation. She helped the man onto it, guiding him down safely to the ground. Outside, emergency crews immediately pulled him further from the burning wreckage, checking for injuries. Angela stepped back, chest heaving, lungs burning, eyes stinging from smoke. Around her, the scene was a blend of chaos and relief. Passengers huddled together, some sobbing, some holding hands, some staring blankly at the fire that consumed their plane. She looked around at the survivors. The elderly man still trembling but alive, the young couple clutching each other tightly, the mother and child crying in relief, the teenage girl shaking but safe. Angela allowed herself a moment to breathe, but the reality of the situation hit her all at once. They had survived something catastrophic, something that could have ended in tragedy for every single passenger. And yet, standing among them, she realized the depth of human resilience. Fear had been present in every corner, but so had courage, cooperation, and determination. The paramedics and firefighters now took over fully, attending to the injured, securing the site, and coordinating evacuation to ambulances. Angela moved among the passengers, offering reassurance where she could, helping guide those in shock and ensuring children stayed close to their parents. Her own exhaustion was total, muscles trembling, lungs burning, body bruised and scorched, but she refused to collapse. There were still people to comfort, still survivors who needed her presence. A reporter from a nearby news crew had arrived, capturing footage of the scorched fuselage and the survivors. Angela turned away, unwilling to be seen, focused entirely on ensuring everyone was safe. She watched as firefighters sprayed the last remaining sparks from the fuselage, the roaring flames finally beginning to diminish. The plane had become a hollowed-out shell, a stark reminder of what could have been. The teenage girl she had carried earlier ran into her arms, sobbing, and Angela held her tightly. "You're safe now," she whispered, voice thick with exhaustion and relief. "You're safe. We all are." The girl's mother joined them, tears streaming, gratitude shining through the shock. Angela released the girl, smiling faintly, feeling the weight of every life she had helped save settle like a fragile victory in her chest. Nearby, the elderly man approached, leaning heavily on the young couple for support. He looked at Angela with eyes wide, almost disbelieving. You saved us all," he whispered. Angela shook her head, voice hoarse but firm. "We saved each other. We survived. That's what matters." He nodded, tears glistening, a mixture of fear and relief etched onto his lined face. The mother with the toddler approached as well, holding her child tightly. She knelt before Angela, sobbing. Thank you for saving him, for saving all of us." Angela smiled faintly, brushing soot from her jacket. "You all did what you needed to survive. You were brave. You're all alive, that's what counts." Around them, emergency crews continued their work. Injured passengers were loaded into ambulances, firefighters checked for lingering flames, and authorities began coordinating transportation and support for the shaken survivors. Angela finally allowed herself to slump to the ground, exhaustion overwhelming her, every muscle screaming. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the adrenaline ebb away, feeling the gravity of the night's events. And then she opened her eyes, watching the wreckage one last time. The plane, once a vessel of travel and routine, now lay twisted and burning, a stark monument to danger, fear, and survival. The screams, the chaos, the panic, all of it had led to this moment. A field of survivors, alive against impossible odds. A firefighter approached her, hand extended. "You did an incredible job tonight," he said, voice low but sincere. Angela nodded, accepting it with a small smile. She realized that despite the terror, despite the chaos, she had played a role in ensuring that dozens of lives had not been lost. But the memory of the flames, the screams, the second-to-second fight for survival would linger forever. The survivors began to gather together, some crying, some embracing, some simply sitting in stunned silence. Angela remained on the edge of the crowd, watching them. Each face told a story of fear, courage, and relief. She realized that survival was more than escaping the plane. It was about holding onto humanity, guiding others, and refusing to give in to panic. And as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, illuminating the blackened wreckage, Angela allowed herself a moment of reflection. They had survived the impossible, faced death in its rawest form, and emerged alive. Every scream, every jolt, every terrified breath had led them here. And though the scars, physical and emotional, would linger, so too would the knowledge that in the darkest, most terrifying moments, courage could prevail. Angela took a deep breath, inhaling the smoky, acrid air, and looked around at the survivors. One by one, they were being helped into ambulances, guided to safety, reassured by emergency crews. She knew she would never forget the terror, the adrenaline, or the responsibility she had carried. But she also knew that life, even after near-certain death, could continue. And in that moment, amidst the smoke, fire, and aftermath of catastrophe, Angela understood something fundamental. Survival was not just about escaping death. It was about guiding, protecting, and refusing to give up when others needed you most. The plane behind them continued to smolder, a haunting reminder of the night's terror. But the people in the field, shaken, exhausted, alive, were proof of one undeniable truth. Courage, resilience, and humanity could triumph even in the face of disaster. And as Angela finally allowed herself to sit, shoulder pressed against the dirt, watching the emergency crews work, she knew that the story of survival, of fear, and of heroism had reached its first conclusion. But its impact would last a lifetime.